I'm going to talk about Sim2real collision avoidance for indoor navigation of mobile robots via deep reinforcement learning. So in this work, we developed Sim2real, which is a flight controller for collision avoidance trained via deep reinforcement learning that, although it's entirely trained in a 3D CAD simulation environment, it can perform collision-free flight in the real world. So let's take a look. In this video, we see a drone that can fly indoor without colliding into things. And in fact, this video is captured while the drone is being controlled by our proposed Sim2real. The input to the controller is single RGB images from a monocular camera mounted on the drone. And the red dot you can see is the steering command produced by our method. This drone can perform collision-free flight in a number of different scenarios, such as flying up the stairs or flying through windows in the walls or going along the corridors, a number of different things. And what's notable here is that this drone hasn't seen any of these environments at the training time, and it hasn't even seen a single real image. So we see that this is quite cool. And it's a lot of fun to make drones fly autonomously in the buildings. But is that the only reason that we care about this problem? That's in fact part of the story, but not the whole story. In fact, this problem is important from the mobility perspective. And mobile robots, such as drones, provide a good context for us to investigate our research questions in the mobility. So let's see why learning mobility is important. It's important from several different aspects. One is embodied cognition. So this is one term from biology, and in that part of science, they study the evolution process of animals, starting from single cells and then evolutionary to the bigger animals such as mammals and humans. And in one stage of evolution, a variety of animals that had perception and locomotion capability emerged. And what's notable here is that at that stage, these animals could actually perform complex tasks such as watching where the food is and going after that, or escaping from predators. And they could perform complex behaviors. And one beautiful example of this is an animal called sea carrot. This animal goes through two stages in its life. In one stage, it is moving. And in another stage, it becomes stationary. And once it becomes stationary, it starts digesting its own neural system. And the point here is that when it becomes stationary, then it doesn't need its brain anymore, so it's to start digesting it. And the takeaway lesson here is that if you do not move, then you do not need an eye or brain. For example, look at trees. They don't have eyes and they don't move because they just don't need it. So we see that for having complex behaviors, we need locomotion and perception capabilities side by side. And we take care of this problem because we are interested to have agents that can perform complex behaviors, and we want to learn algorithms that can do that. So we see that learning mobility is important, but why haven't we yet solved this? To answer this question, let's look at the challenges in vision and control. So we all know about the success of deep learning in computer vision. So in classical computer vision, we have set of static images. There is no interaction going on. And we have huge data sets collected by humans by simple labels. And supervised learning approaches have shown to perform pretty well here. However, when it comes to mobility, our mobile agent can move. And once it can move, then it can explore novel environments, and it can see places from very novel angle points. For example, look at this corridor. If a human comes and takes a picture of this, then usually they take this very canonical view of the corridor. However, when we have a mobile agent, then it moves through different places in this continuous big space. And it will see this corridor from many different angles, which we might haven't seen them in the web images. So you see that we have a huge space, and labeling this space is quite tough. And one other very important thing is that the agent moves, and once it moves, it should survive moving, meaning that it shouldn't put itself into dangerous situations, and we should be able to handle that. So we see that a mobility problem introduces challenges above a standard computer vision. And of course, there are many important applications for mobility. One of them is self-driving car, and the idea of having self-driving car had been around since many years ago. Perhaps one of the very earliest prototypes had been Levine, where it took images and they trained a neural network to produce a steering command. And what's interesting here is that back then, they used a neural network to train these, and they also used simulated images. And of course, the fidelity of simulation were not as good as today, and also the resolution of the cameras. Again, in this problem, the car will see novel views of the environment, and the vision system should be robust against noise and variations. And it should also avoid collisions, which might unfortunately be deadly. And given the success of deep learning, many research groups have started working on this problem, which sort of confirms the importance of this problem. Another application of mobility is, of course, having mobile robots that can move in our buildings. And you would all agree with me that we would like to have mobile robots that can move in our buildings and do different tasks, such as package delivery or providing dynamic surveillances, and many other more applications, such as capturing the virtual tour of the environment. And in this work, in the context of this work, we have looked at drones as a type of mobile robot that we have, but the method that we have developed is not limited to drones and can be generalized to other types of mobile robots. So let's see why this problem is actually hard. So historically, people have looked at making autonomous flight controllers using 3D estimation and mapping or learning from demonstration. So in 3D estimation and mapping, people have looked at using a stereo or depth cameras to make a 3D perception of the environment. And in the learning from demonstration approaches, basically we have a human that, and we want to collect data by demonstration or teleoperation to collect some data to provide some sort of supervision to learning the controller. But we all know that 3D estimation and mapping is quite challenging, and especially if we only have monocular cameras. And if we have more sensors, then this will pose efficiency and energy overhead for the mobile platform. And if we want to do learning by demonstration, then the capability of our controller will be limited by the amount of data that is collected by human, which is usually pretty tough and time-consuming. So what about letting the agent to learn from its own experience and basically using a reinforcement learning setup? So in a basic reinforcement learning setup, you have an agent and an environment. The agent interacts with the environment through making actions, and environment gives feedback to the agent through some rewards. The goal of the agent is to maximize the amount of reward that it takes, and the learning is only done based on the observation that it can make from the environment. Okay, so let's go back to our problem. We have different corridors, and we have our drone. And we want our drone to learn from its own experience. So we let our drone fly. It might collide with things by which we will penalize it. Or it may move forward, and we will give reward to it in that case. And it will run through this loop thousands of iterations until it eventually learns how to fly. And at this point, we're basically done. However, I said thousands of iterations, and that basically means the drone will crash into things like thousands of times, and that's quite not feasible in the real world because it will break itself and will make lots of damages. And this is quite the bitter fact of real-world robotics, which running these experiments is sort of trial and error and has dangers. And again, we will end up having little data, and the controller that we will have again will suffer from low generalization. So one approach to overcome these challenges is through learning by demonstration. And this recently has gained lots of interest. Many different simulation environments had been made publicly available, such as Atari games and other simulations. And learning in simulation is great because it gives us a lot of data, and by the amount of data with the fastest speed that it gives, we have the luxury to focus more on our algorithm and hopefully generate better algorithms for solving these problems and learning better policies. However, the darker side of this story is the reality gap, because by learning in these sort of cartoonish environments, like becoming master in playing Atari games, then our robot agent in the real world still doesn't know how to navigate in the buildings. And of course, people have looked at using transfer learning, where we have source data and a little amount of target data. And the idea is to somehow do fine-tuning or joint training on both source and target domain data to transfer the policies that we have. And several different works have recently proposed for that. However, in our work, we take an orthogonal approach where we do learn a generalizable model through domain randomization, which I will show in the next slides. And the research question that we are most interested in here is how can we actually train policies in simulations such that they generalize to the real world. To do that, we built our own simulation, which has a variety of hallway geometries and lots of different rendering setups. So by highly randomizing the rendering setup at the training time, by changing the light and having different objects and different floor plans and textures and different camera orientation, we could make a controller for indoor navigation of drones that could generalize to unseen environments and could perform collision-free flight both in unseen simulation environments and the real world. So here is our method. The input to our method is single RGB images from a binocular camera mounted on a drone. At each episode, we put the agent at a random location with random orientation, which is basically the observation at each time. And the choice of action is made by selecting one of the beans in a discretized set of beans on an image. And the choice of the beam will be basically the action that we take. And we run the action through the simulation by moving the camera in the velocity command that we generate by selecting each of these actions. And some of these episodes might end up with collision and some with not. And we have a finite horizon. And basically, the reward that the agent will get is based on the distance that it has from the nearest obstacle. And the feedback is basically the return of these rewards, which makes our queue function. And by having these multiple rollouts at every single location, we will end up with a data set of observation, actions, and returns, using which we will have a dense map of probabilities of flying to directions that will lead into success. And having these maps and correspondence between input images and the probability map, we can train a deep, fully convolutional neural network to learn policies for flying in the indoors. And we use a VGG16 architecture for this. So as I said, we do all training in the simulation, but what we're interested to is to test generalization in the environments that haven't been seen during the training, which could be simulation or real world. And I would like to mention that this is quite different from the conventional approach of reinforcement learning, where they test and train on the same environment, and they want to become master in tasks. However, since we are interested in learning policies for real robots, we are most interested to test the generalization at the unseen environments. We have several different test scenarios. In one scenario, we use a set of floor plans from our own simulation, but these floor plans hadn't been seen at the training time. And also, the textures hadn't been seen during the images used for training. And this is an example of the flight that it can make in this simulation environment. And our drone can perform a better flight in terms of the number of collisions they experience compared to baselines and one prior work. And in another test, we use another simulation which has realistic textures and realistic floor plan. And we start each trial of flying in a random location in this floor plan with a random orientation for the drone. And in this case, also, we can perform a long collision-free flight in this environment and beat the baseline and the prior work. And basically, for this experiment, we just stopped the flight because it never did collide, and it was about like a kilometer in distance. And we also visualized the trajectory that was traversed by the drone and compared these trajectories with two different other methods. One is the prior work and one is the baseline. And these trajectories are color-coded based on this color wheel, which show the direction of the flight. And we see that in our case, we could actually explore the environment better because the drone experienced less number of collisions. The last but most interesting one is the real flight. And again, I would like to say that during training, we didn't see any real images. And we qualitatively evaluate the performance with a number of different scenarios. One is the lab setup, where we make a maze, and we fix the altitude of the drone to low so that it doesn't take the trivial solution of flying over these random obstacles, and it can go through this little maze. And in another scenario, we have a long corridor with a turn, and the drone might drift because of some noises in the environment or some wind, but it can recover from these drifts and can make a turn at this junction without having collision. And this goes to the end of this hallway, where we basically stop it. And another scenario is where we have a window in the wall, and the drone here can adjust its altitude so that it can fly through this window. You can see that the steering command tells it to go up and up until it can fly through this window. And in another scenario, we have stairs, and the command that is produced by our method is basically to increase the altitude of the drone to go up and up the stairs. And we actually didn't have any stairs in any of our simulation, so we didn't even have synthetic stairs. But since it has some rough understanding of the obstacles and understands that the free space is above it, so it goes up and up. And we also evaluated this quantitatively, and we used two different corridors with different textures and lighting conditions, and we run our method and also the strongest baseline from the previous experiments, and we saw that our reinforcement learning-based approach experiences collision like around 50% less time than a supervised version of it. So the question that rises here is that from learning in this simulation environment and generalizing to real world, how much of randomization do we actually need? And to answer this question, we collected a data set of static images from real hallways. That also, during the collection of this data set, we had some camera motion and some slide rotations so that it becomes somehow more realistic. And this data set comes with depth information from an RGBD camera. And we use this data just for testing. And we use the data collected from the RGBD camera as a ground truth for free spaces. And we tested on a proxy task, which is basically free space prediction. And here in the last row, I have visualized the score map of the free spaces predicted by our highly randomized learning setup. And you can see that once it is hotter, then it means the probability of having a free space is higher. For example, in here we have a junction, and there are two blobs that show the free spaces. Or in here we have a pillar here, and then we have two big blobs for free spaces. So to evaluate how having randomizations would help in performing this task better, we use the same architecture, but we collected data from different simulation setup where we had less amount of randomization. And we evaluated on this task, and what we observed was that having lots of randomization actually makes the performance better in how we can predict the free space from the closest space. And of course, our method has failure cases. For example, here, it will be confused by saturated light and glassy window, and it basically goes to this corridor, but it sees a saturated light, and it turns, and later it will collide with one of the windows in the wall, which is like a trophy window. So you can watch what is the observation of the drone on the top. So once it goes through this, it doesn't understand that this is a glass, and it will crash into it. Okay, so to improve this, what are the future directions that we can take? One is that this learning setup is built upon some synthetic data set of simulation environment from CAD models, but it needs human engineering to generate this environment, and it could be much better if we could actually make this a step sort of automatic. And this could be done by some randomized synthetic data generation approaches to make more diversity and also handle properties of surfaces such as specular surfaces and etc. And another important thing is to have a more robust approach, because here we have lowest speed for the drone, but if we could handle noise better, then we could have faster speed in complex environments. And this is important to make it more scalable for real life applications. I would like to thank you for attending this talk, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
To the mic in the aisle.
Hi. So I have two questions. One is with respect to the reward metric you followed. You said the reward was basically the distance that it maintains from the nearest obstacle.
Yes.
So
it's the inverse of the distance, but it's normalized so that like the biggest distance is 1 and the smallest is like 0. So it's a smooth sort of reward function.
So it's a squashed reward function. So my question is, did you ever face like situations like where the robot was, if I go forward, I'm going to get negative reward, so I'm just going to stand here where I can just keep on maximizing the reward? Because
no, so we didn't have a stop action, so it never stops.
You never had those things?
Yeah,
okay.
it can never stop.
Okay. So one more question is, so I was actually in one of very similar talks by a PhD student from UC Berkeley who was trying to use deep reinforcement learning in simulation to track a vehicle on the road. So one of the tricks that he employed was to remove, in the convolutional neural network, he removed the pooling layer, which basically counts for orientational variance of the object that's being tracked. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you did something like that.
No, we didn't do that. It's basically a standard VGG16 architecture with dilated operation.
Okay, that's